Hi, welcome everybody. Delighted that you could join us. Please do take a seat. Hi, my name is Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. I just wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My own parents come from what is today Pakistan. My father's side of the family was pre-partition from there, and my mother was born after partition, and just wanted to recognize all of the entangled histories and the importance of looking at being at an art school, at a university, the important calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the important ongoing work that needs to be done at universities, and our own commitments to that as well. Delighted that you could join us for a book launch for Alberto Toscano's Late Fascism. Also, welcome to everyone watching on the live stream as well, and also want to recognize the support of the School of Communication, Alberto's home department, in supporting this event as well. Just the format for the evening, Alberto will give some broad thoughts about the book for a little while. We have some guests with us, which I'll introduce in a more fulsome way. We have Jordie Rosenberg with us. Lisa Lowe will be joining us via Zoom, and Gaston Gordillo. I'll introduce them in a more fulsome way once we get to the respondent part, and then we'll have a chance for questions as well. Alberto, it was really great to be able to read his book. I'm teaching a course on political violence and the right to move in graduate liberal studies. Alberto was able to join our class. It was wonderful to engage with the text just a few weeks ago. If those of you who haven't read it, I highly encourage you to get it. We have pulp fiction books here in the back, able to sell it, and Alberto will be here to sign books as well. So let's get moving here. Alberto Toscano is a term research associate professor at the School of Communication. He's also a professor of critical theory at the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths. I first encountered Alberto's work as a translator of Alain Badiou and read a number of his books on fanaticism and many others. He's also the senior editor of the Italian list for Calcutta-based publisher Siegel Books as well. His research is concerned with the translation and reception of Italian literature, literary criticism, and critical theory. He also edits Siegel essays and sits on the editorial board of the journal Historical Materialism, Research in Critical Marxist Theory. And Alberto has been in town for a few years now, so I think it's fair to say, let's give a warm hometown welcome to Alberto Toscano.
Okay, so thank you so much. So I wanted to begin by just saying how grateful I am to Am, to Brenna, to Lisa, to Jordie, and to Gaston for making this evening possible, and to all of you, obviously, for coming. Hope it will be worth it. And also many thanks to everyone at the Office of Community Engagement and also at the School of Communication for all their help and support. I think in the shadow of the scholasticide taking place in Palestine and the soft and hard censorship of solidarity and of cultural work and political work in universities across the world, but also, and not insignificantly, in this very province, I think it is worth beginning by saying some things about fascism, anti-fascism, and universities. In 1931, in my own country of Italy, the regime officially demanded an oath of allegiance to university professors. So of 1,291, I believe, tenured, so to speak, faculty, 15 did not swear allegiance to the regime. It's a complicated story somewhat because the Italian Communist Party told a number of its members to swear allegiance and then continue to do their communist work underground, so not so straightforward. But I think we should also remember, and obviously I won't go into the history of the German universities in the 30s, many of you will know some about that, but I think it's also worth remembering and worth noting how many of the authors who I talk about in the book were exiled or imprisoned, from Angela Davis to Theodor Adorno, and how many, of course, could not engage in their anti-fascist thought or anti-fascist practice anywhere near a university. And to some extent, that might have contributed also to the openness or to the creativity of some of those reflections, but we could go into that perhaps later. Now, this book is the product of an effort to think fascism as a process and as a potential, haunting our world, riven and unsettled by multiple and overlapping crises. Drawing on rich archives of anti-fascist thought, hopefully ones that many will not have already encountered, I've sought to theorize fascism's social and ideological dynamics, its cultures and its temporalities, rather than naming or classifying movements, regimes, or individuals. Much of our contemporary discussion of fascism, of course, being very quickly reduced to is X, and we all know who he is, a fascist or not. I've tried to approach the relationship between historical fascism and contemporary signs of fascization, so to speak, not by way of analogy, comparing epigons to an exemplar, but by way of a sort of counterpoint, allowing history and the present to illuminate, but also hopefully to unsettle or to disturb and trouble one another. This has also meant foregrounding those features of interwar European fascisms that exceed the frames of canonical interpretations and resonate with our own historical moment. For instance, by reflecting on fascism's deviation from our common sense, generally our Cold War common sense, about a total state based on snuffing out all liberty and autonomy. Fiercely, viciously identitarian, fascism also evades, I think, exhaustive identification. It repeats with differences, scavenging the ideological terrain for usable materials, and not uncommonly from its antagonists on the left. It can flaunt its relativism while trading in absolutes, and for all its Cold War association with a hyper-statist logic of so-called totalitarianism, it breeds its own forms of pluralism and its own visions of freedom. And I think we suffer in our ability to resist fascism precisely by not recognizing what those visions are and how they operate. My wager has been that it is possible to think cogently about the elements of fascism as an anti-emancipatory politics of crisis without equating theory with definition, avoiding checklists of telltale features or streamlined schedules of the steps to fascist victory. The wager is that a critical theory of fascism need not take the form of a kind of diagnostic and statistical manual of political disorders, many of them as there might be. The radical theorists of racial and colonial fascism that have anchored my own reflections in this book, as well as my criticisms of the uses of historical analogy, I think can attune us to four interlocking dimensions of the history and experience of fascism. And I just want to present these just by way of orientation for our discussion as a bit of a summary of the results of sorts of my own travels through this material. The first of these four dimensions is that the practices and ideologies that crystallized more or less laboriously into Italian fascism, German Nazism, and all of their European kin were presaged and prepared by the dispossession and exploitation of the so-called lesser breeds without the law, wrought by settler colonialism, chattel slavery, and intra-European racial capitalism, or what some might call internal colonialism. It is one of late fascism's wagers that our own experience with fascism cannot be understood without what we might call the fascisms before fascism that accompanied the imperialist consolidation of a capitalist world system. Second, fascism has been differentially applied, experienced, and named across race, gender, and sexuality. As we learn from the writings of incarcerated revolutionaries of color in the United States, political orders widely deemed liberal democratic can do harbor here too, institutions that operate as regimes of domination and terror for ample sectors of the population in something like a racial dual state. This means that both in their political origins and their strategic imperatives, abolitionism and contemporary anti-fascism cannot be disjoined. Third, fascism is grounded in a modality of what we can call preventive counter-violence. Its desire for ethno-national rebirth or revanche, stoked by the seemingly imminent or clear and present threat, which is projected as civilizational, demographic, and existential. The epical panic in the 1920s about the so-called rising tide of color and the colored world revolution, in the words of Oswald Spengler, that seeded the rise of fascism after the First World War, has morphed, barely, into narratives of replacement, substitution, or cultural suicide, shared by mass shooters and European prime ministers, my own alike. Fourth, fascism requires a production of identifications and subjectivities, desires, and forms of life, which do not simply demand obedience to despotic state power, but draw on a sui generis idea of freedom. Whether in the guise of decentralized and deputized power or psychological wages, the fascist, as the phantasmatic synthesis of the settler and the soldier, or indeed the cop, needs to imagine him or herself as an active shareholder in the monopoly of violence, as well as an enterprising petty sovereign, with race and nation serving as the effective and ideological vectors of how one identifies with power. Now, if we keep these dimensions in mind, the longue durée of colonial racial capitalism, the differential experience of domination, a political violence that preempts an imagined and existential threat, and subjects as deputies of sovereign violence, we can begin to comprehend how contemporary fascist potentials converge and crystallize into forms of what can and has been called border fascism. Whether that border be a physical demarcation to be walled and patrolled, or a set of fractal fault lines running through the body politic and multiply marked and policed, there is no circumventing the fact that as the cycles of capitalism driving both mass migration and repression converge with the climate crisis, and a racial civilizational imagined crisis is spliced with scenarios of scarcity and collapse, the extreme and authoritarian right will and does map its politics of time, especially its formative obsession with the idea of an epical loss of privilege and purity, onto the spaces of territory. It will also, like its 20th century forebears, seek to gain control over the borders of the body, to patrol and surveil the demarcations between genders and sexes. Now, in November of last year, the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, one of the very few political leaders, I think, who has risen to the challenge of our wretched conjuncture, spoke at that grim spectacle of elite bad faith, the COP28 summit in Dubai. In his speech, he searingly synthesized what fascism might mean in the nexus of police borders, wars, climate collapse, and the centuries-old legacies of colonial racial capitalism. While wielding what might appear as the crudest of analogies, of the kind that I might criticize in this very book, I think he actually shone a light on the critical novelty of our present moment. And I want to just briefly quote from what I think is a remarkable speech that got rather passed over, unsurprisingly, in mainstream news. This is what Gustavo Petro said. I invite all of you to imagine a combination of facts. The projection of the climate crisis in 5 or 10 years and the current genocide of the Palestinian people. Are these facts disconnected? Or can we look at Gaza as a mirror of the immediate future? The unleashing of genocide and barbarism on the Palestinian people is what awaits the exodus of the peoples of the South unleashed by the climate crisis. This immense exodus will have a response in the North. We are already seeing it in the anti-immigration policies of rich countries and the rise of the extreme right within them. Hitler is knocking on the European and American middle-class homes' doors, and many are letting him in. The exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. What Andreas Malm and the Zekin Collective called fossil fascism, Petro has called Gaza as the first experiment to deem all of us disposable. In order to orient the thinking of a resistance against an uneven, if potentially planetary fascism exacerbated by climate collapse. Now, the genesis, the theory, and the practice of fascism is inseparable from the shifting history of warfare. Across its multiple modalities and repetitions, fascism is always, in its own way, an effort to, so to speak, bring the war home, to turn the home into a home front, but also to expunge the menace of class war and of civil war by engaging a kind of social war whose ultimate horizon is politicide, neutralization, pacification. Fascism desires war and domination, but hates actual proper antagonism or conflict, or any struggle that is not predicated on the assertion of pre-constituted and exclusive identities. When the idea that contemporary reactionary and authoritarian movements are fascist is disputed, we can note that it is often by way of stressing the disanalogies with the historical nexus of universal male conscription, mass social movements, and capitalist crisis of the European 20s and 30s. But I think really This only means that we have to rethink exactly what subjectivity and war and crisis means today. I think that the most capacious understanding of fascism we can work with is the one provided by W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in what he called the counter-revolution of property. And I think we can see within that history and within its operations the moments of social war, of civil war, of class war, and of colonial war or counterinsurgency, as well as the carceral war that Orsanmi Burton has traced so powerfully in his recent book, Tip of the Spear. These multiple levels and dimensions of war should also caution us against, and this is sort of by way of concluding these remarks, should also caution us against accepting a liberal framework which can solely think fascism as the visible exception and antithesis to representative democracy and the rule of law, and which consequently seeks to conscript subaltern and oppositional forces into pseudo-popular fronts against the greater evil, the terminal version of which I would suggest is the current demand by the US centrist that agitation against genocide be shelved for the sake of the fight against the fascist menace. This framework is also predicated on the notion that fascism and true capitalism are somehow antithetical. Now, there's an undercurrent of economic thought that I don't deal with probably quite enough in the book, which I think thoroughly refutes this view. It is stated most pithily in one of the two epigrams of the book by Karl Polanyi: "The problem of fascism is as old as capitalism. The threat was there from the start." Writing about fascism in America in the midst of the Korean War, in the pages of Monthly Review, Paul Baran wrote of how the big business military coalition could carry out all the tasks of a fascist regime, securing through state power a mass basis for capitalist domination, while disorganizing any challenge from below, while only adopting its classic forms, its most visibly violent forms, abroad. And that's a very long history in the United States. As he put it in his article, which of course he had to write under a pseudonym, as yet, they need no stormtroopers in the United States, slaughtering the wives and children of revolutionary workers and farmers, but they employ them where they are needed, in the towns and villages of Korea. In the wake of the JFK assassination and Barry Goldwater's presidential run, in 1964, the Polish economist Michael Kalecki advanced that what he called fascism in our time, the title of his article, could dispense with demagogic redistributive claims and promote laissez-faire capitalism, anchor itself in racist or chauvinist slogans at the time for Algérie française or segregation, 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 and find itself subsidized by the most reactionary fractions of capital, while being kept, as he put it, like a dog on a leash by the ruling class as a whole. For Kalecki, what dictated the shape of counter-revolution in the 1960s from Algeria to the US, and I quote, "The main driving force of the fascist movement is the potential emancipation of the oppressed nations, or decolonization in the broad sense, by which he also meant struggles for black liberation in the United States." Now, 60 years on, I think this contradiction between fascism and decolonization remains our own, and I hope, if anything, that my book can serve as a resource for those trying to tackle and to transform it. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alberto. We're going to be going to all of our guests who will be responding. I'll introduce all of them at the same time, and we'll be starting with Jordie Rosenberg, the author of the novel Confessions of the Fox and the forthcoming hybrid work, Good Material from Random House One World. He's also the author of the scholarly monograph, Critical Enthusiasm, Capital Accumulation, and the Transformation of Religious Passion. Confessions of the Fox was a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, was shortlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, a Publishing Triangle Award, the UK Historical Association Debut Crown Award, and longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award. Joining us via Zoom, who's been listening in, Lisa Lowe is Samuel Knight Professor of American Studies and Professor of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale, an interdisciplinary scholar whose work is concerned with the analysis of race, immigration, capitalism, and colonialism. She's the author of Critical Terrains, French and British Orientalisms from Cornell University Press, Immigrant Acts on Asian American Cultural Politics from Duke University Press, and The Intimacies of Four Continents from Duke University Press and the co-editor of The Politics of Culture in the Shadow of Capital. And Gaston Gordillo graduated from the University of Buenos Aires, completed his PhD at the University of Toronto in 1999. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, was a visiting scholar at Harvard and Yale, a visiting professor at Cornell, and a resident fellow at the Bellagio Study Center in Italy. We're first going to go to Jordie. Please. Yeah, whatever your preference.
Maybe I'll stand.
Sure.
It seems easier than figuring out how to turn that on. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I need to leave this open, yeah? Okay. How's the audio? All right. I'm very pleased to celebrate Alberto's achievement today. This is a tremendous book that everyone should read. It stakes a timely intervention into the rise of right-wing movements globally, and specifically into liberalism's obsessive limbing the contours of the fascist analogy to mid-century Europe, an analogy that has saturated public discourse in North America, at least since Trump's election in 2016. And I should say that I come from the US, so a lot of my reference points will be to the US. This analogy has saturated public discourse, that is to say, without advancing anything like a revolutionary position. One has suspected all along, and is confirmed now by the argumentation in Alberto's book, that the obsession with analogical thought around Nazi fascism functions precisely for liberalism to defer responding to fascism in all its forms. Indeed, to deliberately misrecognize fascism in all its forms. These forms are the subject of Alberto's book, which works against analogical thought by way of two main angles of argumentation. The first has to do with, and Alberto spoke about this a bit, moving our understanding of fascism away from the European mid-century context as the single referent for all genocide, and articulating in its place the longue durée of racial fascism, in which the tools of the Nazi genocide were themselves forged in the cauldrons of Western colonialism writ large, and find themselves very much still at work. So devastatingly much still at work that it is at once needless and yet necessary to say that the critical question for us now, which in itself is not raised as such in Alberto's book, but is, I think, both formative of it and emboldened and given theoretical support by it, the critical question for us now has to do with how the operation of the fascist analogy has in many ways wittingly foreclosed in North America the question of the Nakba and of the genocide against which the Palestinian people have been resisting for decades and terribly acutely in the now. The proliferation of liberal analogical discussion about fascism and genocidal violence forecloses discussion of, let alone political action opposing, fascism and genocidal violence against Palestinian people specifically, because the false foreclosures of analogy operate as if analogy were an actual historical law or a law of physics in which there is only one genocide and all other forms of violence are lesser and inevitably failed simulacra. The fascist analogy, in effect, is the foreclosure of the possibility of other fascisms. It is in this truly catastrophic context that Alberto's book gives us a great deal of theoretical framework, history, and argumentation for moving beyond analogy by staging a conversation between the mid-century European context of Frankfurt School thought, among others, about the Nazi Holocaust, and the black radicalism of thinkers such as Angela Davis, George Jackson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and George Padmore, and by thinking fascism not in terms of the singularity of the Nazi Holocaust, but as a racial fascism, the techniques of which have been honed and continue to be honed in the practices of settler colonial statecraft. The details of statecraft and political prescriptions are not so much Alberto's concern, because the book is a work of critical theory. However, the question of fascism in this book is never without its, so to speak, soundtrack, which we hear if we are listening throughout. The question, that is to say, of what is to be done. What is to be done about the fact that the false foreclosures of the fascist analogy don't just exist in language, but are made possible through institutions, as in the attempt to institutionalize what the historian Rana Barakat describes as the systematic and long-standing delegitimization of Palestinian knowledge and knowledge production, and by what the anthropologist Maya Wynn charts around the classifying of Israeli archives, such that Israel's own historical record of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine has been cleansed from the records. It must be said, moreover, that what goes on in language, this analogical foreclosure, is supported by genocide itself, for example, as the scholasticide that Alberto mentioned, the obliteration of Gazan municipal records, every single Gazan university, countless Gazan libraries, and at this date, at least 70% of primary schools. So I think that although Late Fascism is not a political handbook, there are conclusions to be drawn from it about the authorizing conditions under which analogy presents itself as the only way to encounter the question of fascism. And because the Palestinian people have given us the tool of nonviolent solidarity in the form of the BDS movement, there are conclusions to be drawn from this book about the necessary political responses to those conditions. The second angle taken by Late Fascism is to shift the framework for thinking fascism away from the psychodynamics of fascists as such to an understanding of the racial state as structurally fascist, and in the process highlighting the tight bonds between fascism and neoliberalism. Alberto is remarkably immune from getting caught up in the particulars of fascist psychology. Rather, taking a page from Adorno's critique of Adorno, Alberto is more interested in the question of a fascist area, the fascism of control societies, which, as per Adorno, quote, carries out the expropriation of the unconscious by social control, end quote. This crucial shift from diagnosing fascist individual mentalities to describing a fascist area allows Alberto to focus on the question of mediation and what mediations authorize and organize this area, rather than referring the question of fascism always back to individual explanations, personal histories, madness, cathexis, perversion, etc. It is whiteness, Alberto argues, not just at the level of discourse, but I would argue at the level of political experience, that supplements this area of pseudo-collective agency and, quote, imbues it with a toxic psychosocial content, end quote. Genuine resistance against this toxic content cannot get mired in the preponderance of liberal elitist shuddering with which we are surrounded, but must take the form of a robust class politics, which, as Alberto says, far from being the, quote, carrier of the fascist virus, this class politics, a frequent bourgeois misapprehension, is, quote, its antibody. Toward the end of these remarks, which is actually sort of soon, I will make the suggestion that this antibody of class politics has been refreshed for us today by the struggle of the Palestinian people against their ongoing genocide and the refracting effects this struggle has had on North American labor movements. But before I arrive at this point, I'll detail one or two more things about how Alberto thinks about the composition of the fascist area, because what is most interesting about his argument, to me at least, is that he does, in fact, manage to open questions about the libidinal composition of fascism without relying on a symptomatology of the fascist personality. Taking up Foucault's argument against the caricature of Nazi fascism, in which fascism is only fascism if it involves an authoritarian state and the centralization of power, Alberto explains that, quote, for Foucault, to the extent that there is an eroticization of power under Nazism, it is conditioned by a logic of delegation, deputizing, and decentralization of what remains in form and content a vertical, exclusionary, and murderous kind of power. Fascism, argues Alberto, is not just the apotheosis of the leader, it is also the reinvention of the settler logic of petty sovereignty, a highly conditional but very real liberalizing and privatizing of the monopoly of violence, end quote. One of the strongholds of this combined eroticization and privatization of violence, of course, is the settler family. Indeed, the fascist area is characterized by this settler familialism, or what Alberto, citing, I hope I'm pronouncing this Italian name right, Maiocchi? Maiocchi. All right. Citing this individual in 1979 lays out with startling resonance today, quote, amazing quote, "The emotional plague of fascism is spread through an epidemic of familialism," end quote. In a bravura conclusion to his book, Alberto brings the mid-century European, later 20th century Italian, and contemporary North American contexts back into conversation, not to analogize them, but to sort out the complex texture of breaks and continuities therein. Via Tim Mason's work on Nazism, Alberto takes up what we could call fascist racial capitalism's familial fix, which Mason describes thusly. Quote, "The nightmare world of dictatorial government, huge industrial combines, all-encompassing administration, and organized inhumanity was parasitic upon its ideological antithesis, the minute community of parents and children," end quote. Alberto echoes but departs from Mason's view, finding in today's right-wing culture a similar hysteria for familialism, quote, "in which the repair and reinvention of a martial masculinity and the anxious nostalgia for the heteronormative family," I'm cutting shorter some of his statements, "are the foci around which an entire institutional and ideological infrastructure is cohering," but here with the twist that there's an explicit obsession on gender ideology and transness as the nemesis of this epidemic of familialism. Unlike the inability or indeed refusal of some leftist thinkers to develop a textured account of what these anti-trans impetuses are doing, late fascism seeks a more structural understanding. Always Alberto is thinking about mediation, and gender ideology for Alberto holds the place of what I see as a kind of transcendent stitch. Another quote from Alberto, "standing for the planetary process that the fascist international must work together to repel." That is, gender ideology stands for this. In other words, fascist familialism and anti-transness today aren't waged against an administrative authoritarian state, but rather function to suture an otherwise incoherent fascist international, one that has neither its own transcendent horizon nor a singular ideological goal. And it does so at the level of the body, the domestic, and the libidinal. Another quote from Alberto, "Fascism's anti-politics of sex is a strategy for tying the geopolitical to the genital," end quote. I would add here that I think the reason why fascism's anti-politics of sex works as a mediation in this way has to do with a genuine widespread radicalization and left shift in the social that we see in, for example, the amazing preponderance of trans organizing in the service worker strikes, or in Angela Davis's kind of legendary now seizing on the transitional kernel of transness during the George Floyd uprisings of 2020, when she suggests that the abolitionist demand has as its necessary, though not sufficient, condition of possibility the fact of transness, which contributes to abolition a shared horizon. Quote, this is Davis, "If it is possible to challenge the gender binary, then we can certainly effectively resist prisons, jails, and the police," end quote. The extent to which an epidemic of familialism works as a transcendent stitch for the fascist international has to do, I think, in part with the fact that the fascist anti-trans right attempts not only to abject transness from the social field, but also to poach a horizon that is inherent in the lived materiality of transition. The simple but hard-won horizon, or thesis, as the poet and theorist Kay Gabriel puts it in the journal Mediations, that sex can change. Now, this is my conclusion. We can't end on fascism, of course, so let us recall that the antibody to this plague of fascist petty sovereignty and fascist statecraft is, as per Alberto, a robust class politics. One, I would add, that we see in the strike waves of 2022 and 2023 have been led by workers of color and trans workers in critical struggles at Starbucks, Amazon, Unite Here, the Writers Guild, and the UAW. This wave, I would offer, has received a remarkable further intensification as a result of the Palestinian struggle against genocide, a struggle that puts the question of international solidarity back on the table for North American labor unions, and to which many have responded with force. Again, UAW International, Starbucks Workers United, Amazon and Google workers no tech for apartheid, multiple teachers associations, as well, I think, and this is not something I can discuss at any length here, but I think it's worth noting, the entire cultural front, which has been reopened, such that we see literally hundreds of North American organizations sign on to the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, that's PACB, as well as the birth of organizations, very robust organizations, like Writers Against the War on Gaza, inspired initially by a walkout of journalists in protests against the New York Times' shameful coverage. I don't have time to discuss this at any length, but I'll just say it really is worth thinking about how the Palestinian struggle has returned us in North America at a very public scale this possibility of a cultural front. And anecdotally, I will note that years ago in visiting Palestine, I had a wonderful opportunity to speak with a number of Palestinian booksellers, teachers, and knowledge workers for whom the language of cultural front was, as a matter of course, threaded through all our discussions of literature and writing. And this was when, as a trans person and writer, discourse in the US was constantly and unimaginatively overburdened with questions of respectability and representation. So it is very striking to me now to see us catching up, and we know who we have to thank for this. When we encounter, as we inevitably do, dithering in some of our own unions or resistance to joining this movement of solidarity as unions, it often takes the form of a claim that taking a stand on Palestine weakens our leverage. But to make this claim is to ignore the ways that the strength of our unions has been built, in part, in the first place, by a longer rank-and-file strategy that has been put in place by radical caucuses, many of them led by BIPOC workers over many years. For example, the Arab Workers' Caucuses in the UAW, as Zaina Al-Sus, Alex Press, and Jeff Shirky have recently argued in a forum in Jewish Currents. So the objection that our unions would be weakened by expressing solidarity with Palestine is precisely to elide the historical processes by which our unions have gotten strong in the first place. Certainly not by sidelining the concerns of racially minoritized members. In other words, when they do sideline those concerns, that is the sign of a weak union. Palestine has become a mass movement, and our labor organizing must be equal to it. The question of Palestine, as Al-Sus, Shirky, and Press make clear, is a question of what workers have a right to care about, speak on, and organize for, and engaging this question in our unions is part of building stronger unions. We need this work as well because of the ways in which the fact that everyone can see that genocide is happening has a knock-on effect of, yes, radicalizing a huge proportion of the North American public, but also to be clear-eyed about it, and Alberto mentioned this as well, of normalizing or attempting to normalize spectacles of ethnic cleansing at a mass level, and we can see people like Stephen Miller floating fascist fantasies about mimicking just this kind of ethnic cleansing with undocumented people in the US. So Palestine solidarity work is part of the ongoing repair between labor and the left and of fortifying ourselves for what else is to come. Over 10 years ago, Fred Moten, in a talk at the American Studies Association, articulated his gratitude to the Palestinian people for the privilege to participate in boycott. Participating in this movement refreshes what he called our extra-political sociality and returns us to an internationalism otherwise vacuumed out of American politics, which is another way of getting at what Al-Sus, Shirky, and Press have raised around the ways that Palestine solidarity opens a broader question about what we have a right to be connected with in the world and to fight for as workers. When we see workers organizing collectively to protest genocide, we are reminded of Moten's argument, his direct address to Palestinian comrades, his apology, his deep concern, in fact, about the fact that, quote, boycott might do much more for us than it does for you, precisely in allowing us to be in solidarity with you, and with that richness impossibly developed in dispossession and deprivation that compromises the social and theoretical resources of Palestinian life, end quote. The answer, the possibility of collective action in the face of plagues of petty sovereignty, comes to us, unsurprisingly, in very large part right now from Palestine, and the strength that we can and must build is reawakened for us by Palestine and the Palestinian people who have given us the gift of boycott with which to be in solidarity. Always, we are trailing the Palestinians in Palestine in clarity and courage. And so I will end by saying that we have their struggle to strive to be equal to in whatever courage and determination we manage to gain in our own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordie. Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Lisa Lowe, who'll be joining us via Zoom. She's been listening in.
Thank you, Jordie, for that brilliant and inspiring talk. And many thanks to Brenna Bandar, Alberto Toscano, and Am Johal for the invitation and the virtual means to be part of the discussion. I apologize, I have a respiratory virus, so I'm hoping you can hear me. In our contemporary moment, as Jordie has been telling us, bombs are relentlessly decimating schools and hospitals, driving people who survive from their few remaining homes. Austerity measures deepen punishing global economic divides, and authoritarian governments subject the poor, unhoused, and most vulnerable to state violence and imprisonment. It is a time not unlike the one Antonio Gramsci described from a fascist prison a century ago, in which the, quote, old world is dying and the new cannot be born, unquote, in which the failures of an old political economic order and the morbid symptoms of imperial nation states beset by legitimation crises coexist with emergent alternatives struggling to be born. Across the world, crowds take to the street to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, to protest police murders of unarmed Black men and women in North America, to house migrants and defund prisons, and to protect waterways and lands from extraction and the building of pipelines. The ensuing chaos of the dying regime brings its own atrocities and new forms of terror, though, but it also makes possible new relations not yet realized. These collective movements across various colonial and capitalist regions, histories, and populations comprise differentiated yet linked conditions of promise and peril that come together in this urgent and episodically incomprehensible historical moment. Alberto Toscano's erudite, elegantly thought, and patiently argued book, Late Fascism, is aimed in part at giving us the historical and political philosophical means to make comprehensible fascism in our time by coming to terms with fascism in the longue durée. Since available political languages are so saturated by liberal political claims of universal freedom and logics of emancipation, they often avail and are inadequate to deciphering the political present, and they contribute to the misrecognition of fascism as exclusively spectacular and exceptional, rather than as integral to the modern marriage of liberal democracy with capitalism. Toscano emphasizes that this misrecognition is a primary obstacle to effectively understanding, organizing, and struggling against the multiple contradictions of our political present. In discussing the nature and etiology of late fascism, Toscano links but moves us beyond the European interwar examples of fascism's ideal type in Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany, and deconstructs the alleged opposition of fascism and liberal democracy, emphasizing that fascism doesn't possess a singular static model for which we can then identify analogies by checking off an inventory of features. He argues that we must instead approach fascism as a process with multiple origins, locations, and temporalities, occurring dynamically in relation to particular conditions. In a sense, though he doesn't put it this way, he's observing that fascism is a structure, not an event. To paraphrase Patrick Wolf, meaning that it's neither an aberration of wartime Europe, nor a state of war from which its antidote, liberal political freedom, emerges, but it's a historical and ongoing feature of the history of settler liberalism and colonial capitalism. Liberal democracy is not fascism's antidote, but rather its conditions of possibility. Fascist rule may include, but is not exclusively limited to, ultranationalist authoritarian states. Within liberal states, it animates economic loss, and social abandonment, and weaponizes unaddressed atavistic libidinal energies unleashed by the crises and cruelties of the uneven social order, and it turns them against racial, religious, sexual, and gendered others. Toscano illuminates how we must understand fascism as the constellation of reactive formations across ideological and state apparatuses aimed at maintaining or buttressing an expiring, contested, or tenuously held social order. It's not separable from colonialism, but rather imbricated in both historical and ongoing indigenous dispossession, captivity and plantation slavery, and its legacy in racial apartheid, counter-revolution, unfolding against and in anticipation of insurgent rebellions that could challenge or transform the existing property regime, exactly from the peoples, sites, and regions in which occupation and rule has been established. This is the reason that Toscano draws especially upon the Black radical and anti-colonial traditions for incisive theories of fascism, not only to make evident that we misrecognize fascism if we limit it to Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, but also to suggest that fascism is a formation not only anchored in racial and colonial capitalism, but in a sense, it is a persistence and resurgence of racial colonialism in the capitalist present, which predates and endures beyond the European example. Among the book's many valuable contributions, it's this one on which I'll speak in my remaining remarks. In his 1950 discourse on colonialism, the Martinican Aimé Césaire identified the origins of fascism in the project of colonial subjugation when he said that Nazism had, quote, applied to Europe the colonial procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for people in the colonies of Africa and Asia, unquote. Guyanese Walter Rodney wrote that, quote, fascism was a monster born of capitalist parents, the end product of centuries of capitalist bestiality, exploitation, domination, and racism exercised outside of Europe, unquote. Trinidadian George Padmore regarded apartheid South Africa as the classic fascist state, and the African-American poet Langston Hughes often declared the conditions faced by Blacks in America as fascist. In other words, before Nazi violence came to epitomize fascism, Black radical thinkers had been detailing fascisms associated with colonial dispossession and racial slavery for some time. Toscano invokes particularly W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America as a key text in the analysis of the entanglement of fascism and liberal democracy. Black Reconstruction, of course, is the monumental history of U.S. slavery as the foundation of capitalism and liberal democracy. The revelation of slavery's brutal commodification of human beings brought into crisis the claims of a liberal democracy, just as the power of the enslaved workers' general strike to transform a system of violent racial inequality lay beneath the liberal political claims to universal freedom. Du Bois argued that slavery, which had forcibly brought Black workers into the modern world system, was at the heart of a modern liberal capitalism, and as such, slavery wasn't aberrant to liberal democracy. It was and continued to be systemic and constitutive of U.S. democracy and to the extension of American power around the world. Du Bois's history tells the story of 500,000 Black workers who, by their mass exodus from the southern slave plantations, created a general strike and brought the Confederacy to its knees, and moreover compelled the North to make the abolition of slavery its issue. But Black Reconstruction ultimately recounts the thwarting of Black freedom, or what Du Bois calls the re-enslavement of the Black worker, by consolidating whiteness in the alliance of Northern industrialists and Southern oligarchy, and the separation of the white peasant workers from a potential cross-racial class solidarity with Black workers. What Du Bois calls a counter-revolution of property precisely exemplifies the fascist formation to shore up white capital and white supremacy against a potential insurgency that held the power to end slavery and racial apartheid and to transform the political, economic, and social order. But in presenting what Cedric Robinson called the Black construction of fascism, Toscano focuses especially on the Black radical thinking represented by the correspondents of political prisoners Angela Davis and George Jackson as under-recognized theorists of, in a sense, American fascism before fascism, which compels us to rethink the theoretical debate over fascism in relation to the situation of imprisoned Black American intellectuals under racial capitalism. Davis and Jackson were both arrested, of course, as you know, for the alleged roles in an armed confrontation to free prisoners in a Marin County courthouse. And from that position, in prison, they theorized carcerality and criminalization of Black political dissent as central to the maintenance and the reproduction of American fascism. As the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore has taught us about the social, economic, and ideological conditions that led to prison expansion in the United States, the so-called prison fix was never an isolated phenomenon, but was a restructuring of the state that expressed the crisis of US racial capitalism. That is, racial capitalism has always been inherently unstable, and it comes into crisis when the contradiction between accumulation and exploitation reaches a level that is unsustainable, expressed in the US by overproduction, diminishing profits and unemployment on the one hand, and widening wealth gaps, racial segregation, and the policing of poor communities of color on the other. These contradictions dialectically produced antagonisms that erupted in radical Black, brown, yellow, and red power movements, labor strikes, urban rebellions, and social movements, from women of color feminists to anti-apartheid and anti-war, to which the state responded with the buildup of military, police, and prison capacity. To justify itself and its monopoly on force, the state worked ideologically to compel identification with multicultural citizenship in the nation and punished those quote-unquote threats to national security of that citizenry by distinguishing between so-called legitimate use of force by police and military and the illegitimate violence of dissent and rebellion. Although the expansion of the state's repressive functions has multiplied the spaces in which communities are made vulnerable to state violence, such violence isn't restricted to incarceration, militarization, or policing alone. Poor, racialized, immigrant, and formerly colonized communities are also devastated by neoliberal privatization, deregulation, and extractivism that protects corporations and undermines labor and indigenous protection of the environment. These too are operations implicated in fascism and the expansion of the US carceral state. Angela Davis and George Jackson, taken up by Toscano for their prison writing and correspondence, discuss the prison buildup by the US state as an exemplary form of fascism, combining monopoly capitalism, imperialism, and capitalist crises, and counterinsurgent suppression of political dissent. In one of his letters, Collected in Blood in My Eye, written from prison, discussed by Toscano, George Jackson wrote, "When I am being interviewed by a member of the old guard, and I point to the concrete and steel, the tiny electronic listening device concealed in the vent, the phalanx of goons peeping in at us, his barely functional plastic tape recorder that cost him a week's labor, and point out that these are all manifestations of fascism, he will invariably attempt to refute me by defining fascism simply as an economic geopolitical affair where only one party is allowed to exist above ground and no oppositional political activity is allowed." George Jackson's detailing of fascism doesn't resort to comparison with Nazi camps, but rather centers the condition of the prison from the perspective of a US Black incarcerated political prisoner accused of armed revolutionary activity and later murdered by prison guards. Jackson focuses on the materiality of the prison industrial complex, from the technologies of surveillance to the prison personnel. As a political prisoner, Jackson is astute about fascism's counter-revolutionary formation. Like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, he observes that like Ruth Wilson Gilmore's observations about the US post-war racial state, Jackson is commenting on fascism as the, quote, restructuring of the capitalist state as it fails forward. Gilmore emphasizes that the decisions to build prisons is an investment in industrial punishment, policing, and military as a social discipline of the population rather than investing in public welfare, healthcare, roads, or schools. As Toscano observes, fascism is not only a counter-revolutionary restructuring of the capitalist state, it is also an anticipatory one against a deferred, suppressed, or ongoing reckoning with an abolition struggle that has been ongoing since before Reconstruction. Late fascism includes this imprisoned Black radical tradition, along with a dazzling range of anti-fascist thought, from Ernst Bloch, Georges Bataille, and Leo Lowenthal to Jarius Banerjee and Furio Jessi, rendering fascism not a monolith, but a range of responses to colonial and racial capitalist crises. Toscano, in his own words, dislodges the debates about fascism from the deadlock of analogy, unquote, providing the resources to effectively understand our historical present. Moreover, the excavation of fascism's longue durée is a compelling insistence on the coloniality of the present. In Cedric Robinson's words, it, quote, resurrects events which have systematically been made to vanish from our intellectual consciousness, unquote, and permits us to understand our present conditions anew. In this sense, late fascism is concerned with what we might call a colonial history of the present, that is, defamiliarizing accepted historical narrative and unsettling the givenness of the present, the givenness of nation and empire, of current racial, gendered, economic violence and inequalities, and towards creating the conditions of possibility for other outcomes and futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and a shout out to the tech folks to make that sound wonderful. I love it when that works. Thank you. Next, we'll go to Gaston.
Hi, everybody. I'm really delighted to celebrate Alberto's really fantastic book. And thanks, Brenna, in particular, for inviting me to join this panel. Alberto's Late Fascism is a crucial intervention in the growing debates about the rise of fascist sentiments today. First, because it demonstrates the limits of the liberal progressive critics of these emergent neo-fascisms. Alberto reminds us that if we want to fight fascism effectively, we need to radicalize. For the Bidens and Trudeaus of this world are not actually opposed to neo-fascists, but fully implicated in their rise. In what follows, I explore this political argument, but also another major contribution of Alberto's book, an attentiveness to the affective dimensions of fascism as a desire or affective disposition, both today and in the past. And Alberto, as both Lisa and Jordie showed, builds these arguments through a truly amazing archival work, exploring, dissecting, and comparing multiple, often forgotten, but politically crucial genealogies of anti-fascist and anti-white supremacist thought and action. It is a book that helps us appreciate the extraordinary intellectual work done by generations of our anti-fascist predecessors, and how many of their insights are crucially important to understand our grim present. Alberto begins the book by reminding us that the point of examining contemporary fascisms should be to generate an anti-fascist political project. Hence the question he poses in the opening pages, and I quote, "What is the connection between the theorizing or naming of fascism and anti-fascist strategies?" And the book's answer is that to articulate anti-fascist strategies today cannot be simply to defend liberal democracy, to choose Biden over Trump. For in fact, liberalism and fascism have never been opposed to each other, but are actually part of the same social and affective imperial formation. The best example is, of course, the so-called liberal democracies of the West supporting and arming the openly fascistic and genocidal regime of Netanyahu in Israel, which is nothing but a new iteration of waves of racialized terror that have a long genealogy. And this takes me to the second of Alberto's main political points, which follows from the first. Drawing, as I noted, from many critical thinkers who have thought long and hard about this question, Alberto demonstrates that to speak of fascism is to speak of capitalism, and that we cannot devise an effective anti-fascism that is not at the same time anti-capitalist, an idea that will certainly horrify liberal and progressive critics of fascism. Hence the importance of the last line in Alberto's book, where he writes, and I quote, Whoever is not willing to talk about anti-capitalism should also keep quiet about anti-fascism, unquote. The reason is that anti-fascism, and these are Alberto's words again, is not just a matter of resisting the worst, but also the collective forging of ways of living that can undo the lethal romances of identity, hierarchy, and domination that capitalist crises throw up with such grim regularity, unquote. I want to focus here on this powerful idea of fascism as a lethal romance of identity, hierarchy, and domination. For it takes us to another major thread throughout Alberto's book, that fascism should be examined, in his words, as a psychic and libidinal phenomenon, not just a socio-political one. That is a desire, or as he puts it, an erotic charge. This is, of course, a point made by many authors, most famously Foucault and others, for instance, the idea that fascism is not guided simply by ideologies or identities. For many people, in fact, desire fascism and strive towards it in a bodily and visceral sense. Or to explore this idea further, this eros or desire is a bodily impulse, what Spinoza called a conatus, a striving. In different historical moments and places, these fascist dispositions emerged shrouded in different symbols, gestures, and narratives. But they tend, as Alberto shows, to share a family resemblance. Inspired by the radical black thinkers who have long reflected on this question, the key analytical and historical move that Alberto does in this book is to compare contemporary fascisms not so much with the classic European fascisms of the 1930s and 40s, but with the racialized terror that has long been foundational to European colonialism. One of the powerful epigrams that opens up the book by Longstone Hughes from 1936 says, and I quote, "Fascism is the new name for that kind of terror the Negro has always faced in America," unquote. And this, of course, brings to mind the famous quote by André Césaire from Discourses on Colonialism that Lisa also referred to, where he argues that Europeans tolerated the savagery of Nazism before they became their victims. For, and I quote Césaire, "they exonerated, they closed their eyes to it, they legitimated it because until then it had been employed only against non-European peoples," unquote. This liberal exoneration of fascist terror, this looking away from the horrors inflicted on racialized bodies, resonates all too painfully with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which illuminates with disturbing clarity the continuities between different forms of fascist terror and how genocidal dispositions are also machineries of desensitization towards the suffering of their victims because they have been dehumanized. This affective selectivity of fascist dispositions, this capacity to be affected by the death of some but not that of others, is always historically and geographically situated and therefore unique. But it also responds to the elemental structures that define fascist and genocidal dispositions throughout history. While Alberto doesn't quite make this point explicitly, I think that's the direction his work hints towards. This transhistorical interpretation of fascist dispositions may unsettle those who advocate locality and difference over claims of a universalist nature. But here I think it's important to remember a point made by Fanon in Black Skins, White Masks, and I quote Fanon here, "It is utopian to try to ascertain in what ways one kind of inhuman behavior differs from another kind of inhuman behavior. Is there in truth any difference between one racism and another? Do not all of them show the same collapse, the same bankruptcy of man?" Unquote. Perhaps we could interrogate fascism along similar lines, learning from Alberto. Is there in truth any difference between one fascism and another? Don't they all show the same type of human bankruptcy? And this takes me back to Alberto's idea of fascism as a lethal romance, or a sad passion guided by reactive negativities. A consistent component of fascist dispositions in their different historical manifestations is that they make people willing to unleash violence on bodies felt to be savage, threatening, or polluting. This is why the desire that has historically guided Nazism in Europe or Jim Crow terror in the US is a murderous disposition. And Alberto shows that this terror is not always centralized by the state. In settled colonial situations, this disposition becomes particularly apparent in the deputization of violence following a logic of delegation, through the petty sovereignty of the settler who exerts a microphysics of terror on racialized bodies. As Alberto put it, and I quote, "Fascism is not just the apotheosis of the leader above the sheep-like masses of his followers," unquote. It is this microphysics of everyday fascist terrors, this elemental affective structure that connects our late fascist present with previous fascisms in Europe and elsewhere in the world. But needless to say, in different historical moments, this fascist disposition, this fascist desire does adopt distinct manifestations. And Alberto does show that there is something specific about today's late fascism. In his words, late fascism is thus both a reaction against certain facets of the neoliberal moment, those to be coded and sometimes racialized as globalist, and a passionate over-identification with the coercive dimensions of the anti-state state, unquote. And this reactive passion is consistently framed from the United States to Argentina as a righteous struggle for freedom, which coded in a fascist fashion is nothing but the freedom to dominate and rule racialize others and impose legitimate violence on them. This sad passion for freedom is parallel to a profoundly visceral disgust at equality, or in the words of Alberto, a repulsion for solidarity, care, and vulnerability, unquote. These late fascists, ironically, often present themselves as rebels and even revolutionaries, like the current far-right president of Argentina, where I'm from, Javier Milei, who ran on a populist campaign against la casta, or the ruling caste, as he called the established political elites in Argentina. But as Alberto notes, and as is also the case of Milei, these fascists calling for a pseudo-insurgency, those are Alberto's words, are in fact, and I quote Alberto, largely emptied, albeit with important exceptions, of mass movement and utopia, unquote. This means, I would add, they often even dislike mass street mobilizations. And I want to illustrate this again from another recent example from Argentina, when the far-right author or personality Agustín Laje a few days ago expressed how much pleasure he felt in seeing the images on TV of leftists being beat up by the riot police sent by Milei's government to crush anti-fascist protesters. So on the one hand, this guy Laje expressed this pleasure, again, that he felt at seeing violence on leftists, but at the same time, he made a revealing admission. He said, "I am very scared of the streets because the Milei supporter is not a violent voter. We're not used to rallies," unquote. And then he added, "The other side is the one which has all the force, the brute force and anti-democratic physical force," unquote. This is why Laje added in this comment that was shared online that it was imperative and for him a source of pleasure to send the police to beat up those powerful, scary mobs controlling the streets of Buenos Aires. And this takes into another feature of today's neo-fascisms. One of Alberto's amazing insights, based once again on his incredible review of multiple genealogies of anti-fascist thought, is that he views contemporary fascist dispositions as intrinsically out of sync, strangely but revealingly disconnected in a profoundly effective manner from the material rhythms and political and environmental realities of our warming planet. This is an idea that Alberto takes from Ernst Bloch, who wrote back in the 30s that fascist personalities tend to mobilize non-synchronous people out of sync with contemporary rhythms. Alberto shows that in the global north, this asynchronicity with the present is clear in the Trump supporters who express, and I quote Alberto, fantasies of a white industrial patriarchal modernity that have a post-fascist, post-war period as their seabed, unquote. In other words, and paradoxically, as Alberto notes, it's a nostalgia for the days that followed the defeat of fascism in World War II. And I would add that in the case of Argentina, Milei's asynchronous nostalgia for a past goes farther back in time, to the late 1800s, following the genocidal violence against the indigenous people who then controlled half of the country, when General Roca, the so-called conqueror of the desert in Argentina, became president and led the efforts to whiten the nation and get rid of racial others. Milei has said, inspired by Trump, that he wants to make Argentina great again, and for him that meant going back to the 1880s and 1890s when Roca became president of the nation. But that late fascists are out of sync with the present is particularly clear in their climate denialism. And Milei is again a good example, for he has repeatedly called climate change a Marxist hoax. A final point that is central to Alberto's thinking is that fascism has always been guided by counter-revolutionary and counter-insurgent impulses. Yet in other words, to speak of fascism is to speak of the fear of insurrection and revolution. Yet one of the paradoxes of the late fascisms of today is that we live in a moment in which capitalism is not facing a revolutionary threat, as it was in the 1930s. So Alberto asks, what, we may wonder, is late fascism trying to prevent? Alberto answers that our late fascism has become not a preemptive counter-revolution, as thinkers like Angela Davis theorized in the 70s, but a sort of preemptive counter-reform, given that today the most popular demands for change are rather reformist rather than revolutionary in nature. But Alberto offers a Gramscian way out of the pessimism of the intellect that guides any realist assessment of the current balance of power in the world. Appealing to the optimism of the will of those of us who often feel overwhelmed by the power of our enemies, he writes, and with this quote I finish my remarks, and these are Alberto's words, on a more optimistic note, that progressive or liberal reforms may appear to racists and reactionaries as signs of a communist dystopia that is almost already here, could also be interpreted as the distorted recognition of utopian traces that demand to be blasted out of the continuum of reformism. An ideal for the left might be to become what its enemies think it already is, namely a strategically ingenious and systematic endeavor to undermine white, Western, Christian, capitalist civilization across all institutions of society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we live in very intense and passionate times. It's only fitting that the interventions were just that as well. So thanks to all three of you. Before I go back to Alberto to respond to some of these interventions, I was just going to add and punctuate some of the points that were made, but you have a great chapter on the fascist love of freedom. You go quite deep into it in the book. Another part, the one that's called Cathedrals of Erotic Misery, you talk about this contemporary, the insane fixation with critical race theory, gender politics, and other ways that these movements are inflected today. So I'll pass the mic over to you, Alberto, just to respond to these interventions, and I'll get you to respond to him, and then we'll go out to the audience for questions.
Okay, well, it's rather daunting. It's a humbling experience to have brilliant friends and comrades you admire speak with such insight, and a nice out-of-body experience to have oneself quoted by in that way, in any case. So I don't have a response, as maybe just wanted to draw from Lisa and Jordie and Gaston, maybe a thread that I can perhaps reflect on, though. First, I should also say that the only reason that there is a chapter 6 is was Jordie's was correspondence with Jordie about, let's say, what were some of the rather glaring lacunae in some earlier drafts of the book. So I wanted to signal my great indebtedness, and you who might read and or enjoy that chapter are also indebted to Jordie by proxy. So I think maybe partly because it's so significant to this very moment that we're in, and because I think in different ways everybody homed in on it, I think one of the ways in which we can think both cognitively and politically of what I think is a kind of chasm between a liberal anti-fascism and an actual anti-fascism has to do, I think, with a question of scope, and even of the temporality of political struggles. So one of the things that I think is very noticeable, and the US case is only the most glaring and the one we're all sort of forced to think of, even if we're not citizens of that declining hegemon, is that liberal anti-fascism has a very, a kind of bad faith politics of urgency, right? Whereby the aim of the declaration that fascism might be imminent, with an I rather than an A, imminent, is to massively restrict the scope of our politics, of our attention, of our solidarities. First of all, to restrict it to the national and to the electoral space and to its time, but also precisely to riff on Lisa's variation on the Patrick Wolf sentence, to treat it as an event rather than a structure, to constantly disavow the structure. Whilst one of the things that I found so inspiring in trying to bring together some of those black radical theories of fascism in particular, but also a number of anti-colonial and third world theories of fascism. And incidentally, there is, especially in the past few years, a vast and extremely rich set of studies and books and work on all of these traditions, of which my book is only like touching the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But one of the things that I found extremely inspiring was instead the capacity to open political spaces and solidarities and temporalities as well, right? That anti-fascism, first of all, has to be radically international or even anti-national, and that it has to be radically curious, and that it also has to work against that kind of political common sense and the liberal politics of the lesser evil, which alas always makes the greater evil possible. I think that is so glaring in our moment that I don't think my book is necessary to make that point, but hopefully it gives some of the resources to think through it. I think it's very evident that the role of a certain invocation and incantation of fascism at present is don't look over there, don't think about other scenes, other people, other spaces, and there's also very much of a kind of national egotism that is built into it. Even more, one of the and this has been the grim story of so much of the past period, especially as concerns the nexus of fascism, anti-immigration politics, and borders, and this is a long story in Europe, is the repeated gesture of needing to preempt the rise of fascism by basically doing what it desires, right? And now in the grotesque scene of this funding bill in the United States, which is really a grotesque scene, where you have the wrapping together of one of the most militarized, draconian prospects for border regimes with funding for the continued onslaught on Gaza. You have precisely this moment which repeats this liberal policy, which we've seen in the UK, Italy, Germany, and plenty of other places, of anticipating the rise of fascism, the supposed rise of fascism, by legitimizing its horizon, its mentality, its so-called concerns. To which we can also add, and this is where the question of the structure and subjectivity or affect is significant. One of the things that we've seen, and this is, I think, especially true in the United States, but also elsewhere, is that one of the characteristics of contemporary far-right movements is basically to assume and glorify and identify with that which liberalism, governing liberal governments reproduce and advance but disavow, right? As a kind of terrible necessity of living in a complicated world, etc. And so the fascist is in a sense the one who affirms, you know, and this is very clear in terms of border politics, not just in the United States but elsewhere, but affirms and intensifies and celebrates the structural violence that the liberal disavows, right? I think that's one of the ways in which we can think the connection. I was really also appreciative of Gaston bringing in the question of the temporality of climate. And I think that is significant to me because what we're seeing now is a variation on both one of the affective and, so to speak, philosophical, historical dimensions of fascism, which has always been a pessimism of sorts, right? Sometimes a pessimism cloaked by, you know, bravado and spectacle, but a politics that is ultimately and intimately justified by the sense of loss and the sense of decline, and in a way even the inevitability of decline, and that sometimes leans into that decline as sacrifice, as a desire for catastrophe, and sometimes instead, like in our own more egotistical and conservative, in a sense, moment, especially as relates to climate, but also inequality and austerity, is the sense that you know, to use that terrible pseudo-economic analogy, right? Like the pie is inevitably shrinking, and therefore, you know, it should be, you know, defended at all costs and limited only to those entitled and privileged to have it. But there is no, that's I guess what I meant by the hollowing out of a sort of utopian, dystopian for us, utopian for them, or kind of future-oriented dimension. And I think that, so I think in some, you know, like effectively, the climate deniers are not climate deniers, right? Effectively, in terms of the politics, the lifeboat politics, the fortified border politics, I think it's actually based on what is now a kind of material translation of the far right's perennial politics of decline, which is now intensified by the fact that that decline and that crisis is not just, you know, a vaguely civilizational crisis, it's not just a fantastical demographic, racial crisis of degeneration, but is perceived as, you know, even when it's denied, right, as a kind of material crisis with its own temporality. And I think that's why I was so struck by Gustavo Petto's speech and by the effort to make that articulation, right? And to make that articulation as a political intervention as well, which whatever one may think about the exact terms or rhetoric of it, I thought was an extremely powerful and very rare move, right? That we might encounter in, you know, some sophisticated theoretical domains, but very rarely in the political arena. But I want to hear from other people. Just wanted to say, you know, I'm so grateful for such brilliant responses and such generous readers. So that's great.
Before we jump into questions, I'll give you each a couple minutes just to respond to Alberto. I know Lisa's listening online. Lisa, if you turn on your camera, we can bring you up at any point. But go ahead.
Well, I'm not even prepared yet to respond. So let's just see if Lisa or Gaston wants to respond first.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree with Alberto's comment about climate denialism is more complicated, and Pedro's line that Gaza anticipates the future in terms of the exodus from areas hit hard by climate catastrophes is definitely spot on. But at the same time, I guess I'm thinking about cases like Argentina. Some members of the far right are indeed in total denial, and Milei and his followers, they even deny this is happening, or this is a natural cycle. Those type of explanations. Even when Argentina has been going through a terrible drought for the past few years, and the evidence is overwhelming. So, and I agree also with Baum's work on the fascist celebration of fossil fuels, and how, in many ways, there is a certain pessimism, as you point out, in these fascistic views of the future in connection to climate change. But I will agree that I would argue that at the same time, denialism cannot be written off the agenda of at least some sectors of the far right who want to keep on pushing for more pipelines and fracking and so forth.
Can I ask Gaston a question? Yeah, I can ask Gaston. Just because you dealt with the rise of Milei, and because Argentina, alongside Chile and Brazil, was such a laboratory for what even the mainstream, left liberal economist Paul Samuelson was forced to recognize, even in his textbooks, right? Was market fascism, right? So he started. It's very interesting. In 1948, he writes the major textbook, and it's like capitalism and fascism are totally different things. And by 73, he's having all these problems with the editors of the translations into Spanish in Brazil and Argentina and Chile, because the censors are like, you can't call this market fascism or capitalist fascism or imposed capitalism, etc. But I was wondering in the Milei case, and in this moment in Argentina, because I do think it's revelatory, or at least can be seen maybe as revelatory of some tendencies, whether this this kind of loony libertarian, extreme anarcho-capitalist libertarian version, how do you see that relating to earlier iterations of the nexus between capitalism and fascism or authoritarianism? I mean, is there something you think is new, just out of, because I have you here and other people do as well. I'm curious.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I could really spend a lot of time. No, Milei is a fascinating embodiment of this merging of capitalism and fascism, because he's a I wouldn't say anarcho-capitalist, I think hyper-capitalism. Mm-hmm. He wants to really remove any type of regulation or labor regulations, environmental protections, and give corporations basically a full freedom, in the name of freedom. And right now there's a profound political crisis, because basically he sent a bill to Congress trying to abolish 300 laws, which was absolutely a lunatic move. And anyway, that move failed. There's a lot of turmoil. A lot of the protests I referred to is because there's a lot of mass mobilization against this. But to give another illustration of the role of Milei today, Milei is now in Israel. He met with Netanyahu, and they jointly celebrated the capitalism. They celebrated, Milei not only supported the genocidal violence in Gaza, but they together also made statements in defense of market economies. So here we see this blending of capitalism and neo-fascist sensibilities in the case of Milei and in Netanyahu as well come together in a profoundly clear and disturbing way.
Thank you. We'll go out for questions. We'll maybe take 2 questions in a row so we can get to as many as possible. I will ask you to get to your question. If you're going long, I'll give you a little 15-second warning to wrap up to the question. There's the first question coming right here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. The mainstream media describe hyperinflation as a leading cause for the electoral victory of Javier Milei. So I'm wondering if you have other explanation why people in Argentina did not embrace the progressive left as a viable alternative and chose Javier. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question back there, and we'll come back for some responses.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk, Alberto. So I just want to bring kind of the tradition of the Frankfurt School kind of into the fold, where Adorno kind of came up with this kind of like weird like fascist checklist in 1947, which was kind of an odd move for someone that favors the abstract character of the negativity. So I'm just trying to understand maybe like in relation to that and looking at kind of your post-colonial approach, how do you reconcile with kind of like the concrete realization of fascism through the charismatic leader with the abstract character of the potential of fascism that may have like caused Adorno to kind of like depart from his usual kind of like abstract and dialectical negativity and kind of like focus on 30 like concrete questions that like determine whether you have the personality of a fascist or not, which was like really a really odd departure from him. So I'm just wondering if that kind of factors into your thought.
Thanks.
So I'll leave conjunctural analysis in the Cono Sur to my comrade on the right, and see if I can answer the Adorno question. So one of the things that I found interesting and useful in turning not just to the work of Adorno, but to that of basically the Frankfurt School in exile, or the Institute for Social Research, to be more precise, in exile, in the United States, was the way in which it already, right, was a displacement and deterritorialization of the problem of fascism. Of course, members of the Institute for Social Research were engaged often, interestingly, under the heading of the Office for Strategic Services, which then morphs into the CIA, including Marcuse and Neumann and Kirchheimer, et cetera, in doing intelligence research, let's say, on the state of everything from, German workers to, industrial combines to what have you. But the Institute for Social Research was, of course, doing research on the potentials of American fascism, which at an effective, immediate existential level, they thought was very high, not least because, as many of them repeatedly pointed out, they experienced a lot more explicit anti-Semitism in the US in the 1940s than they had before the rise of, the coming to power, right, of Hitler, just at the quotidian level, right? And so there's all of these fascinating bits of research, much of which, again, there's been really excellent research on recently. For instance, some of the projects that never made it into book form, right? Like studies of fascist potentials and of anti-Semitism in particular amongst workers, where they were sending, these kind of, militant plans, so to speak, right? Like starting conversations with workers, see where they would go and come back with these elaborate reports and so on. So one of the things, and a lot of people, of course, turned to that material in 2016, especially to Leo Lewinthal's and Norbert Guterman's book, Prophets of Deceit, which is a study of these kind of, hucksters and demagogues and, radio shock jocks of the 30s, right? Because the devices and the rhetoric and the modes were, scarily identical to, not just Trump, but, Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck, et cetera. And there was a kind of queasy continuity to the whole thing, right? So in that moment, and this gets to the checklist, right? In that moment, one of the pivots that happens with the Institute for Social Research, very complicated pivot, both theoretically and materially, and partly because they just have to pay the rent, or they're also suffering because they lost a lot of their endowment in a financial crash. They're buying real estate in New York, which is interesting in its own right. But then they're starting these projects, right? And these projects linked to the American Jewish Committee that then give rise to the Studies on Prejudice, right? But what their political aim, their political pedagogical aim at that moment, from 41 to when they go back to Germany, I think, is to generate a kind of mass anti-fascist education or pedagogy in conditions of mass liberal democracy, which they see as having, for all sorts of complicated reasons, these potentials, right? And so Horkheimer, for instance, is really set on the idea that they need to produce a handbook, like that people can take to their factory, to their school, to their church, to their city, whatever, right? they're thinking about making films. So that's the kind of context, right? And Adorno is fascinating because, of course, I mean, and he's also done all this like market research basically for the Princeton Radio Project. And he's in this very peculiar ambivalence, right? Which then leads to him writing all of these kind of self-criticism of these projects, saying, well, actually, it can't be, you know, the personality is only significant if, you know, the political economic conjuncture does this and that. It's really about capitalism producing surplus populations and not just about what's in people's heads or hearts or whatever. So I think it's a very interesting situation. The way that I then think the bringing in the question of the black radical theories and anti-colonial theories of fascism, particularly into that discussion, is that I think it really expands and deepens the nature of what these fascist potentials are. One of the things that is bewildering is that, and this is true of Prophets of Deceit, it's true in many ways, and the authoritarian personality is slightly more complicated, but you know, the Institute for Social Research are writing about US racism with basically no reference to Jim Crow, to the history of slavery, to anti-black racism. It's like, you know, at times there are these kind of like glimpses, and the authoritarian personality in a very sort of rigid way does talk about, you know, anti-black prejudice, but mainly in the context of thinking through anti-Semitism. But, you know, Prophets of Deceit, you read the book and it's an amazing book, but it doesn't tell you that some of these agitators are basically like members of the KKK. And that's like as though that were just not part of the picture, right? And so I think that like enormous missed encounter, so to speak, is of note, right? I think Enzo Taverso somewhere talks about the meeting between C.L.R. James and Adorno once that, had no consequences whatsoever for either of them. But in any case, that then of course is very different, right? When we move 20 years hence to, Angela Davis, to the way in which the question of preventive counter-revolution is developed, and also in dialogue with Marcuse and with that tradition, right? But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. But I think going back also to that kind of moment of exile, as well as to all of the institutional dimensions of it and the political dimensions of it, I think can also dislodge some very staid and very unhelpful visions of what the Institute for Social Research of the Frankfurt School did, right? And it's funny, right? Because the flip side of this is the insane conspiratorial dimension that this has taken on the US far right, right? There's a book, which I haven't read, but I've read about, or I've rather glanced at, by a New York Times bestseller, over 1 million copies. Alas, I don't think I'll make it. A guy called Mark Levin wrote a book called American Marxism. The book American Marxism, it refers to the Franklin School of Berlin. And these books, they all repeat the same very weird bits of like garbagey, cut and pasted material from each other's books, and you can never reach like the original ever. But they have these theories that basically like Jörg Lukács in 1919 as a commissioner for the Hungarian Revolution kind of invented gender ideology, which is kind of fascinating in sort of like steampunk counterfactual way, but doesn't really bear out. And so that kind of image that actually these, and that sort of racial imaginary, right, of Jewish men and black women generating this movement that will destroy America or whatever, the pictures of Marcuse and Angela Davis are always returning. All of that is the kind of upside down grotesque version I think of some of the threads that I wanted to also think through, right? To think of a kind of expanded anti-fascist tradition. And lastly, to that comment, but also relating to some of the points that were being brought up, especially in Jordie's really powerful reminder of the place of Palestine in these discussions. One of the things that is, of course, I should underscore is not just that there's, plenty of brilliant scholars that have relied on for this work, but also that there are a lot of anti-fascist traditions that I know of, but don't really know because of my linguistic limitations, etc., including, the question of fascism plays a signal and significant role, at least as far as I can make out, for the English language publications in the 70s of the PFLP, the writings of Hassan Kanafani, and so on and so forth. And it's a complicated question, right? Because it's not just like, Israel's fascism and then ends at that. There's a very complicated discussion of the fascistic dimensions of the Jordanian regime. And there are analytics that were developed in different contexts, right? There's a I touch on barely, extremely rich traditions already in the 30s in Japan of thinking of what their Marxist theorists called emperor fascism. There is a really expansive and rich domain that I kind of merely touch on, but I hopefully my book will be some kind of goad for people to explore those dimensions, and also as a way of breaking out of this. People no longer really stick with like Third International, Georgi Dimitrov theories of fashion, but they definitely have their brains and discourse, colonized by various forms of liberal anti-fascism that I think massively restricts our imaginary, our cognition, our references, and so on, right? Fascism was already an object of complex radical theorizing before, the Nazis even came to power, right? Like, we forget this, and so we see also everything in a very distorted and reductive historical lens, and hopefully, the book can be a kind of contribution to get out of that to some extent.
We had one other question.
Yeah, on the question of Javier Milei in Argentina, absolutely. A high inflation had a lot to do with his victory. People were facing a very grim economic situation. It wasn't hyperinflation, though. I mean, it was getting bad, but by the time he was elected, inflation was roughly 10% a month, super high. But now, to give you an example, after he took office and he totally liberalized the economy, inflation is now at 30% per month. So hyperinflation is now on the horizon, in part because of his extreme kind of far-right policies. Why he was elected, there are many factors. The far right began growing with the lockdowns associated with the pandemic. The previous president was very unpopular. He was a very mediocre government. But also, I have to say, part of Milei's success has been his very eccentric personality, and he's emotionally very intense. He was on TV all the time, basically. He had no experience in office. He was just an economist who was on TV all the time and gesticulating and yelling and making funny faces. And back to the emotional and affective power of some of these far-right candidates or politicians, people kind of resonated with him at an emotional level. And they couldn't understand what he was saying. And again, it's at some level, it's incomprehensible why he was elected, because he's kind of crazy, and people agree now. And many people have voters' remorse now and are regretting his vote because things are unraveling fast in Argentina right now. But I think the affective power of his personality stood out, and many people thought, okay, let's give him a chance. He's different, he's promising radical change. But today, many are regretting their vote.
We're getting late on time, but we don't get together very often. So let's take two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. And Alberto will be around to sign books and answer any other questions you might have. We have one over here and one over here.
Okay, I'll run with the 15 seconds here. This is probably like 60% in a response to Jordie, the daddy dialectic, which I know Alberto quotes in the book. Quick question. The fascist can be a pervert, but can there be a perverted state, especially given the dialectic of liberalism and fascism together? Neither seems to necessarily be a perversion of the other if we're theorizing the two together.
Great, thank you. We'll take one more question there.
So first of all, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. So many examples of fascism that have been brought up today. We often point, we never point to Canada. It's always somewhere else. It's always the United States. It's always the US, it's Europe, historically, South America. Zeroing in on Canada and Canadian fascism, there's been a profound relationship here between the Canadian ruling class, capitalism, and the Canadian myth of a multicultural Canada and neoliberal class-based multiculturalism connected to fascism. For example, the relationship between Canada's PM Mackenzie and Adolf Hitler, as well as Canada's history of rehabilitating not only Nazis through the immigration process, but also Canada's relationship with fascist Japan and rehabilitating some of the highest ranking Japanese fascists as well. Why is it that when we talk about fascism, do you think that Canada continues to fly, fascism and imperialism, that Canada continues to fly under the radar of being observed as a historically non-fascist, non-racial capitalist entity, when it is in fact a current racial capitalist fascist entity that funds other fascist colonial entities such as the Netanyahu Zionist fascist entity known as Israel Today, and then defunds Palestinian organizations, therefore making them complicit in genocide?
Thanks for the questions, and we'll just take these final responses before we wrap up.
Okay, so yeah, why why does Canada fly under the fascism radar? For some, but maybe not for all. I mean, I think one of the tricky things about thinking through the idea of fascism as a process, of fascism as structure rather than an event, etc., is of course one runs and one can be criticized, right, for the risk of flattening out and so de-exceptionalizing fascism, right, that it becomes kind of it becomes indistinguishable from other political realities, frameworks, movements, etc. And actually, to go back to Lisa's point, that was actually part of the divergence, comradely divergence between Angela Davis and George Jackson, who did not have the same theory of fascism. George Jackson basically thought that, U.S., big society, LBJ, reformism was itself, right, like the latest and highest stage of fascism, not just because of his vantage point, but because of its particular way of managing and regulating capitalist accumulation and so on. Whilst for Angela Davis, who took, albeit in a much more sophisticated way, nevertheless, a position that was a bit more adjacent to, communist parties and movements in that period, the difference mattered, right? So yes, fascist terror, racial terror was being meted out against internal oppressed nations, against incarcerated people, etc. But it did make a difference whether and how it was going to expand, consolidate, etc. Right? So that's part of the reason why I am myself, like I think just for maybe it's a matter of sensibility, political sensibility or whatever, cautious or reluctant to just use the term too liberally at the same time as, or not liberally in the sense of as liberals do, right? At the same time as I think the point that you raise is really significant, especially when we think about it through dynamics of imperialism, right? Which we haven't talked about a lot, but is of course, as everybody from Du Bois to Polanyi has pointed out, like absolutely the matrix, right, for fascism as an international phenomenon. And I think what happens when we expand the field beyond not just the borders, but beyond, who gets to be a citizen, who gets to be seen, and who gets to count, and so on and so forth, then it does, even if one doesn't necessarily call, states that present themselves as liberal as, ipso facto fascist or whatever, I think you're entirely right that there's a very long and often denied and grim history of the continuities, articulations, enabling, and so on and so forth, right? Vis-a-vis, especially vis-a-vis Latin America, right? And especially via extractivism via, the support or the benevolent, integration of, for instance, the Chilean dictatorship in the case of Canada as well, right? Or at least the Canadian government, right? So I think that is really significant, and I think I think the way people already, as early as the 1950s, like in the quote that I had from Paul Baran from the Monthly Review, identified the ways in which countries that presented themselves, in fact, as anti-fascist, not just as post, but as anti-fascist in the 50s, depended for the reproduction of their hegemony on forms of terror, domination, and oppression that were functionally indistinguishable from the very things that they were putatively fighting against, right? And except they were doing it in Korea or they were doing it in Haiti, et cetera, right? So I think like undoing the ravages of that kind of methodological but also ethical and cognitive nationalism is really significant. And even more so in a settler colony, right? Where those demarcations, right? The differential perception of the state, the experience of the differential experience of fascism is the historical experience, which is the norm of radical rightlessness and oppression under conditions that are viewed as liberal or equal or free for some, right? This is also, of course, the history of, white European democracies that, until historically the day before yesterday didn't give vote to their workers, to people who didn't have property, et cetera, right? So, no, I think that's extremely important. And I'll leave the question about the state and its perversions to you, Jordie.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to I'm just going to answer that very, very quickly. My first thought when I heard you bring up that piece of mine was, oh no. Just in the general way that one does feel that way when their older work is brought up. But I guess I'll just say really, really briefly, I don't have a definitive answer, and I guess I'm curious what yours would be. The only thing that I have been thinking about this, I guess, in the past couple years really has been that, I think it would be interesting to go back and it is interesting to go back and revisit some of the theories around what Jaspir called homo nationalism. And fortunately or unfortunately, Jaspir is here tonight, so feel free to correct me if I'm misunderstanding anything. Luckily, she doesn't have a mic on her, but I'll just say that I think really broadly and colloquially speaking, maybe, at the time that theory was kind of taking shape in the U.S. Around the War on Terror, I think there was like a general sense of maybe on the left amongst queers that what we're looking at is this assimilation of queers into the liberal state, and that's part of the way that the liberal state justifies its goodness in the face of the barbarism that it must bomb. And I think in a way, actually looking back on that time now, and in light of, say, some things I've been thinking about with Alberto's book, and something actually Alberto said earlier is that really, what does it do to our understanding of the fortunes of homo nationalism if we think that actually, we were very anxious. Oh no, we're being assimilated. We're not normative. We don't want marriage, etc. But if we think, actually, it wasn't really about assimilating us at all to make the state look good, but really it's a projection of what Alberto describes as this fascist right to enjoy, the way that liberalism can't own its own fascism and the right to enjoy, so it gets projected out onto tanks with pride flags and bombs with pride flags. And then you see, I mean, this is way too neat and a totally specious claim, but by the time you get to Trump, of course, they have no need to project their right to enjoy their own violence onto queers anymore, and we can go back to being the bad object, and the state is just, fully fascist. Same in, there's lots of examples of figures of the state here and elsewhere just saying I am fascist, but and we know that. So I guess that's the only thing I can think about that, but I'm very curious what others
I mean,
are
it sort of
cooking
goes
up.
back also to the point that Gaston made about the attraction, right, of license and obscenity as something that is not purely functional, right? Like the kind of libidinal wages that are offered by certain figures. And I think, that the very different kind of like regulation of desire that goes into these camps, I think you've done a really good job of underscoring that. So.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you, Jordie, Lisa, Gaston, Alberto. Congratulations again on having this book out into the world. And Alberto will be available to sign books as well. So thank you so much for being here.